What if I told you that everything you are, your thoughts, language, emotions, began not with cities or gods or kings, but with apes who stood up and walked into history? Long before the first wheel turned, before pyramids rose or empires fell, before words were ever written, there was the earth, a wild, brutal, magnificent planet teeming with life and death. And on this ancient stage, a small group of primates took the first steps in a journey that would change everything. This is the story of us, how we became human. Our journey begins in Africa, around 7 million years ago, in a world unrecognizable to us. Forests stretched across regions that are now dry savannas. Giant predators roamed free, and up in the trees, a species of ape clung to the safety of the canopy. Among them lived a creature that scientists call Sahelanthropus tchadensis, one of the earliest known hominins, the ancestors of modern humans. It was small, about the size of a chimpanzee. But here's the revolutionary thing. Its skull suggests it may have walked upright. Why does that matter? Walking upright, bipedalism, freed our hands. Hands to carry, hands to craft, hands to kill. It was the first great divergence from our ape cousins. Over millions of years, nature would sculpt this new path through trial and error. Most species went extinct, but one branch endured. In 1974, a team of archaeologists in Ethiopia unearthed something extraordinary: the partial skeleton of a 3.2 million-year-old female hominin. She stood just over 3 feet tall. Her brain was small. She couldn't speak, not in words, but she walked upright. She was given a name, Lucy. Lucy was no fluke. Her species had adapted to life both in trees and on the ground. This flexibility was critical. The African environment was changing. Forests were shrinking, grasslands expanding, predators getting faster. Those who could adapt survived, and so evolution, slow and ruthless, continued its work. About 2.5 million years ago, a new genus appeared, Homo. Homo habilis, handy man, was the first human ancestor known to use tools. Rocks were no longer just rocks. They were blades, scrapers, weapons. Simple, yes, but revolutionary. Tools were technology, and technology meant control over nature. More food, more safety, more offspring. With tools came something else, a bigger brain. Over time, the brain size of hominins grew dramatically. Why? Because brains help solve problems, find shelter, hunt, care for children, collaborate. But brains are costly. They consume vast energy. To support them, early humans needed protein-rich diets, and that meant meat. So they became scavengers, and then, eventually, hunters. Then came one of the greatest discoveries in human history: fire. We don't know exactly when, but perhaps 1 to 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus learned to control flames. Think about that. Fire meant warmth in the cold, light in the dark, and, most importantly, cooked food. Cooking made meat easier to digest, releasing more nutrients and feeding those ever-growing brains. It also kept predators at bay and allowed social groups to sit together at night, share stories, teach, and bond. Sparks lit more than just wood. They ignited the first human culture. For over 6 million years, all of human evolution happened in Africa. But around 1.8 million years ago, something changed. A species known as Homo erectus began to move. They crossed deserts, followed rivers, and braved unknown landscapes. They spread into Asia and then Europe. They survived ice ages, megafauna, and isolation. In these far-off lands, new branches evolved. In Asia, they became Denisovans. In Europe, Neanderthals. And in Africa, something special was forming. Roughly 300,000 years ago, in Eastern Africa, a new species emerged, Homo sapiens. wise man. They looked like us. They were us. But early Homo sapiens were not alone. The Earth was still shared with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others. At times, they interbred. In fact, many of us today carry traces of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. So what made us different? The answer lies in something invisible, but world-changing: language. Not just grunts or warning calls, but symbolic language, abstract thought, and storytelling. It allowed us to plan, teach, deceive, imagine, and cooperate at scales no species ever had. And with this gift came another: culture. By 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were doing things no species before had ever done. They painted images of animals on cave walls, art thousands of years before writing. They buried their dead with beads and tools, suggesting ritual and spirituality. They created music, fashioning flutes from bird bones. Why? Because we had become more than just animals. We had become storytellers. We saw patterns in the stars, faces in clouds. We imagined gods and monsters. We asked, why are we here? What happens when we die? The human mind was awakening. Around 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. A group of Homo sapiens left Africa, just a few thousand strong, and began to populate the world. They crossed into the Middle East, then spread across Asia, Europe, and eventually into Australia and the Americas. They met Neanderthals and Denisovans and often outcompeted them. By 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the last humans left on Earth. We had become a global species. As we spread, we adapted. In cold climates, we made clothing and built shelters. In forests, we learned to trap. In grasslands, we hunted mammoths and bison in coordinated groups. Somewhere along the way, we befriended wolves, the ancestors of dogs, forming the first known alliance between humans and animals. These bonds weren't just emotional, they were tactical. Dogs helped hunt, protected camps, and offered companionship. By cooperating with animals and each other, we conquered the Earth. By 12,000 years ago, after hundreds of thousands of years as hunters and gatherers, humans made another leap: agriculture. In places like the Fertile Crescent, China, and Mesoamerica, they planted seeds, domesticated animals, and built permanent settlements. Agriculture gave rise to food surpluses. Surpluses allowed population growth. Growth led to villages. Villages became cities. Cities birthed governments, religion, and war. In the blink of an evolutionary eye, we went from scattered tribes to the architects of empires. But none of it would have been possible without that first step, without those ancient apes who stood up and walked. Today we carry smartphones instead of spears. We build machines, not stone tools. We live in a world of concrete and code, but beneath it all, we are still them. We are the product of fire and bone, of storms weathered and stars watched, of ancestors who dared to imagine a world beyond survival. They didn't know where the journey would lead, but they began it for us, and this was only the beginning.